So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Emil Gous from South Africa. I am from the University of South Africa, and it's truly an honor to serve as convener for today's session. I am a postdoctoral research fellow. I'm an international disability advocate and autism advocate from South Africa with a focus on neurodivergence, inclusive education, disability rights, and the experiences of underrepresented communities within the global south. I would like to warmly welcome all of our speakers and attendees joining us today. My role today is to briefly introduce our speakers, help to guide the discussion, and facilitate audience questions throughout the session. So thank you very much. So today our session is going to occur in the following manner. Late and misdiagnoses are common across neurovariations. Many older adults were misunderstood or mislabeled in childhood. Some only receive recognition in midlife or later. Diagnosis can bring emotional and mental relief and coherence, but cannot make up for lost years and may also spark regret or disorientation. Cultural and national disparities in adult diagnostic services mean many older people globally lack access to altogether. This session explores how diagnosis in later life may assist reshaping identity, belonging, and access to support. Our first guest is Professor Brendan Kelly, Substance, Meaning, and Resonance of Diagnosis. Professor Kelly is a professor of psychiatry at Trinity College Dublin, consultant psychiatrist in Tallaght University Hospital, Dublin, and visiting full professor at the School of Medicine at University College Dublin. He has authored and co-authored over 400 publications in peer-reviewed journals and 23 books. His recent books include Buddhism in Psychiatry, Moving Beyond Mindfulness in Mental Health Care, Palgrave Macmillan 2025, and The Modern Psychiatrist's Guide to Contemporary Practice Discussion, Dissent and Debate in Mental Health Care, Routledge 2025. Professor Kelly, the floor is yours. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for the invitation here this afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and thank you for the kind introduction. Now, I will try to share my screen, if that's okay, and we'll see how that goes. Sure. There we go. I hope. Perfect. And okay, I think I'm sharing my screen okay. Am I sharing my screen okay? And can you hear me okay?
It's perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Thanks a million. So look, I am a psychiatrist, and what I am going to do today, if that's okay, is I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about diagnosis in general in psychiatry, and then focus a little on the areas of autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, particularly in older adults. And I would be very keen to take comments and questions toward the end of my time slot, because I won't talk for the whole time. You'll be relieved to hear. So, substance, meaning, and the resonance of diagnosis. And I will start, this is a really nice paper that some of you might know, called From Diagnosis to Dialogue, a call for support of older adults with a late autism diagnosis. It's well worth taking a read of in the Gerontologist, a paper from the Netherlands. And these authors, the abstract, we won't go through it all, but what they looked at previous research, they looked at personal professional experience of 18 older adults diagnosed later in life, And fundamentally, they called for a conceptual shift in how gerontology or old age medicine understands and addresses autism among older adults. And this is, this is necessary, this is very true, but I want to focus in on the challenge about diagnosis and what diagnosis can mean from this paper. And what they do when they look at people's reported experiences, they say most participants in the study who had autism or late autism diagnoses, they were proficient at putting into words how they cope. Many of them indicated they had spent their entire lives adapting, and as our chairperson said, that can be for very, very many years. And they faced both implicit and explicit pressures to conform and worked hard to understand their social world. And this effort allowed them to participate. The cost was high, and what the authors say here is camouflaging their true selves often led to exhaustion, chronic stress, and burnout. Now, I think most people here today know this, and for many people, a diagnosis can alleviate these matters. However, these authors also show the other side of this argument with a quote from one of their participants. And this is a quote from one of the participants who said, I am so afraid that if I say something about my diagnosis of autism too quickly, people will run with it. People have in their heads a number of characteristics they think belong to autism, and they throw them over you like a blanket. This must be the case with you too. In other words, a series of preconceptions about what they expect, how they expect someone with autism to behave, what they expect the features to be. And what this participant said is, no, this does not have to be true about me. I can be somewhat different. And the reason this paper I find useful is that it points to some of the pluses of appropriate diagnosis, perhaps relieving the exhaustion, the stress, the pressure for so many years, but then also some of the negatives that it can click into ideas people have in their heads and then apply rigidly to the person. So a nice demonstration of both sides. And the other reason I like this paper is because this is a problem right across psychiatry or mental health care, or indeed parts of medicine, the nature and the challenges of diagnosis. So stepping back and looking more broadly at the purpose of diagnosis in psychiatry. Now, this is something I write about at great length in the book that was mentioned in the introduction, The Modern Psychiatrist's Guide to Contemporary Practice, which is an open access book. You can download it for free. And there's a chapter about why diagnosis happens at all in psychiatry. And I guess some of you might recognize this kind of picture here that I'm showing. Anyone who has walked part of the Camino de Santiago in Spain will know that these yellow arrows provide direction. They are not absolute, but they do provide direction. And in many ways, the diagnosis in psychiatry is like that, in the sense that it is not the path, but it can provide useful direction. But it should not be confused with being the path itself. And of course, all conditions in psychiatry are based on symptoms, not brain scans, not blood tests. We do those for certain kinds of dementia and other things, but broadly speaking, diagnoses are based solely on symptoms, commonly co-occurring clusters of symptoms, and therefore they change over time. However, if we did not have these concepts, it would be literally impossible to do any research about treatments. We would not know, for example, that cognitive behavior therapy is helpful in obsessive compulsive disorder if we didn't have some kind of diagnostic criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder. So having diagnostic criteria enables research, and that enables treatment. And that is a very important role. If we are to offer treatments and supports on the basis of evidence, we need to know what conditions are helped. So the purpose of diagnosis, number one, enables research and clarifies symptoms. So there are commonly co-occurring clusters of symptoms, and it helps to clarify these clusters. Another feature of diagnosis is it validates experience. So very often I will have someone who's very confused about what they're experiencing, and I might show them a list of diagnostic criteria for depression or for ADHD or for something else. And they will often read the list and say, so other people have had this cluster of problems as well. It's not just me. That is a very, very powerful way to support communication and understanding about different commonly occurring clusters of symptoms. And therefore, with the diagnosis facilitating research and helping people to guide treatment, to know how to organize care and what to offer. So for example, I know that if somebody has most of the features of obsessive compulsive disorder and they're distressed by it, I know there is an evidence base for certain treatments. The person may not like the label obsessive compulsive disorder. They might not like labels at all. Nevertheless, we can use it as a pivot point to guide treatment, to guide support, and to guide care. And that is a very legitimate, I would call it an instrumental purpose of diagnosis in helping me as a mental health professional know what to offer people who come with significant states of distress. To an extent, it can also predict how things will go in the future, although it's not great at that. And then it can help to a degree with assessment of risk. So for example, if somebody comes with a low mood, feeling depressed, and I ask about everything that's in the diagnostic criteria for depression, for example, I can be reasonably confident that that discussion has covered most important items and items associated with risk, particularly risk of harm to self. So stepping back entirely from autism and ADHD, diagnosis in psychiatry is based on symptoms, reported symptoms only, no blood tests, no brain scans for most things. But it does serve a purpose if it is done skillfully and well in enabling research, clarifying groups of symptoms, and often this sense of recognition. It validates someone's experience as they say, oh my goodness, I recognize 6 out of these 10 symptoms. And then you have a lovely basis for a discussion about how you differ from the criteria, how you accord with them, and where this gets us in terms of treatment. Does it mean I have a better idea about what I can recommend you do? And in that way, it can help to organize care. So that is the purpose of diagnosis in psychiatry. Now, how does it work in practice is quite another issue. And I guess a lot of the discussion about this centers on what these diagnostic manuals, and I'm just showing the most famous one, which is DSM. This is the American Psychiatric Association's guide to diagnoses, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, some of you will be familiar with these diagnostic criteria for various things in these books. And I'm a psychiatrist, and I commonly read that the DSM, for example, or ICD, another diagnostic manual, are the psychiatrist's Bible. Now, this used to annoy me profoundly because in practice, we tend not to use these very much except as general guidance, and some people ignore them completely. But then, as I thought about the phrase, the psychiatrist's Bible, I became less annoyed because I began to think of how do people use a Bible or any religious scripture. What happens is a lot of people completely ignore whatever the scripture of whatever religion they belong to, if any. Some people pick the bits that make sense to them and ignore all the rest. And then there's a small number of people who believe every word literally. So in a sense, DSM, if it is used wisely, is used in that way, that parts of it that make sense to people or to professionals can be used for shared understanding, but parts can be completely ignored, exactly as most people do with religious scripture in any religious tradition. So I'm no longer so annoyed about the description of DSM as the psychiatrist's Bible, given that many people completely ignore or selectively interpret a religious scripture. Many of the problems with these diagnostic systems comes from misuse of the systems. And indeed, in DSM itself, it warns sternly against misusing diagnostic systems. So this is from the DSM, where it speaks of use of clinical judgment. And it says, if you look towards the end of that quote there, it says the diagnostic criteria in DSM are meant to serve as guidelines to be informed by clinical judgment and are not meant to be used in a rigid cookbook fashion. So that is literally in DSM itself. It warns sternly against over-rigid interpretation. And it goes on, for example, the exercise of clinical judgment may justify a certain diagnosis, even though the clinical presentation falls short of the full criteria. Obviously, presuming the person has severe and distressing symptoms. And a lack of familiarity with DSM can reduce its utility. And its use, if you look at the last line there, its utility as a common language for communication. So the diagnostic systems are meant to be applied with clinical judgment in the context of the person, and the DSM itself, it literally says, do not use this in a rigid cookbook fashion. So it's, as I said, about using diagnosis flexibly in the context of the person and not in a rigid way. It has to serve an instrumental purpose. It has to help with understanding, help with reaching community, and guide with treatment and support. So, to summarize all of that in one slide, diagnosis in psychiatry, if it is done well, it is accurate, it will empower people, it will deepen self-acceptance and self-understanding. Someone will start to understand things about themselves or accept things about themselves, and then it will also guide toward treatment or coping strategies. And very powerfully, the use of diagnosis can connect with a peer community for support and understanding. So that's diagnosis in psychiatry when it is done well. Now, I have another column here, unfortunately, and I imagine we're all familiar with this, which is when diagnosis is done poorly. In these instances, these diagnostic criteria are not particularly well met by the person. They're not present, the symptoms aren't there. And if diagnosis is done poorly, it can be disempowering. A label or a diagnosis can be experienced not as sort of self-understanding, but as othering a person. It can reduce self-acceptance and diminish understanding, as if a diagnosis is parceled off, as if it's not part of the person, and it can reduce the sense of self-understanding and the self-acceptance. It can create confusion or expectations of treatment that are unsatisfied. And most worryingly, it can amplify feelings of difference or isolation. That is if diagnosis is done poorly in psychiatry, and sometimes it is done poorly. So diagnosis is a very powerful thing. It's very psychologically important, and it's also can be very, very useful. Done well, it helps. Just to summarize, done poorly, it harms. And this is the case across all of psychiatry. It's not solely the case in relation to certain conditions or certain disorders. And for those of you who are in Ireland and readers of the Irish Times, I think tomorrow there's a very nice piece by the journalist Emer McLysett about her diagnosis of ADHD and how that was, from what she writes in the newspaper tomorrow, was done well, and how it was empowering and how it guided toward treatment and coping and so forth. Really, really nice demonstration of one side of the column here, which is how diagnosis done sensitively, carefully, and in a robust way, but in a really sort of responsible way and participatory way, can do all the good things there in the diagnosis done well column. And I probably don't need to talk any more about the done poorly column. I imagine most people are familiar with certain examples of that they have come across. So that is diagnosis in psychiatry in general. And I think we are seeing these issues writ large or very commonly considered now, given the sort of attention being devoted to ADHD and autism spectrum disorders, and the historical correction or the correction of a historical failure to engage and a historical failure to diagnose, which I think is currently being corrected to a degree. Um, so that's the diagnosis in psychiatry part. As mentioned, I do go on and on about this quite some length in this book, which I emphasize again is free to download from the website and free to share or whatever. And in the section on psychiatric diagnosis and human rights, I argue that clear published guidelines bring clarity and accountability to diagnoses, if diagnosis is to be done, and to treatment. This is profoundly important because various terms in psychiatry carry enormous weight and should only be used with great care. And in many societies, these diagnoses carry not only personal meaning, but they can carry social stigma, they can carry legal implications. So diagnostic terminology is uniquely powerful in this regards, and its use, and it should be used when appropriate, but its use should be judicious, circumspect, evidence-based, and accountable. And once we adhere to this clearly and in partnership with people, I think diagnosis can be used positively, particularly for connecting people with guidance, support, and treatment that might have been denied them for many years, and also creating a greater sense of community. Okay, so that said, I want to return a little bit to the specific conditions. This again, a really nice paper called Being a Woman is 100% Significant to My Experiences of ADHD and Autism. And this paper looks at the gendered implications of adulthood combined autism and ADHD diagnosis. So this is a really nice, really interesting paper for this period, these years, while the underdiagnosis of many of these conditions is being corrected. And I think there's a sort of a settling process still happening about how all of this lands. So it's really helpful to see papers coming out looking at all these different aspects of it: age, gender, the implications for treatment, for self-awareness. And this is I like this paper a lot. And again, this paper is free to download for people seeking to read about it. And this paper looks at women's experience of adult diagnoses of these conditions, particularly the gendered experience of combined diagnosis. And this paper looked at 6 late diagnosed ADHD women and looking at the sort of complex interplay of the various factors in these women. And to summarize, they write that the impact of female hormones exacerbated struggles with perimenopause, another area that is only getting the attention it has so long merited now. And this was often a catalyst for seeking diagnosis after decades of trauma. And part of that trauma, of course, is the lack of diagnosis and subsequent difficulties socially and in families and so forth. The epistemic injustice of not knowing they were neurodivergent compounded the trauma. Now, the idea of epistemic injustice is quite complex here because there was not a more general awareness of this for much of the time. So it is difficult to know to what extent people themselves should be sort of feeling it's unjust if there wasn't a broader awareness. But this is experienced as injustice, injustice to do with knowledge about not knowing one is neurodivergent. And diagnosis enabled participants to overcome this and move them to a feminist standpoint, challenging gender inequalities relating to neurodiversity. Now, I'm just going to leave that there. I'm not incredibly well qualified to talk about a paper about being a woman and the significance to these diagnoses, except to point out that it is significant according to this research, and certainly I'm entirely convinced that a lot more needs to be done on the gender dimension of the sort of diagnosis, and I guess particularly the later diagnoses in women, and then the interact with various perimenopausal issues that arise. And here's sort of someone's experience, because this paper looked at these six women. Someone who says that over the years they were frequently diagnosed with anxiety and depression and low mood over a 20 plus year period, when realistically they were all related to autism and ADHD. And this is interesting because, I mean, in recent years, the professionals should have had a fairly high index of awareness of these conditions. But like 20 plus years ago, most of the professionals, including the likes of me, did not have a particularly high index of awareness of these conditions. So there are many sort of epistemic injustices, if you like, there. Someone else goes on and says, for years I believed I was bipolar, and now she believes what she was experiencing was a combination of ADHD, hyperactivity, autistic burnout, and antidepressant-induced hypomania. So that's a whole complex of things there. Sort of feature of ADHD in this person, and then autistic burnout being more a failure by us, that is to say, society, to recognize autism and provide appropriate accommodations and support, and then sort of the possibly inappropriate prescription of antidepressants, given the lack of awareness of the other diagnoses over many years. So we're looking at very complex pictures as Juliet tries to look back over her past and figure out what was going on, which is very, very difficult to do, but can be a very helpful process for some people. Sticking with these lived experiences here, here's another participant um, really talking about one of the benefits of diagnosis, and this idea of being officially autistic, and therefore struggling socially far beyond what most normal, and that's the word of the paper, people do, meant I wasn't actually a failure of a person. I wasn't actually to blame for the years of bullying I endured or the string of sexual assault and worse that I suffered. That what it was instead was that as an undiagnosed autistic girl, I was a vulnerable target. I was naive. I was poor at reading social cues, at noticing social danger signs, noticing red flags. A string of bad people taking advantage of my vulnerability was actually not my fault in any way. And what's so interesting to me is the power of being, if you look at the first words, they're officially autistic. How this moment of becoming officially autistic or moment of diagnosis brought this whole, if you like, this cascade of self-understanding, this almost retrospective self-understanding and alleviation of guilt that she apparently inappropriately felt. And then I guess it brings sadness as well at those years during which, as undiagnosed, she was a vulnerable target and maybe would have been less so had diagnosis been more readily available many years ago. So I think this is another really nice paper. I just want to draw attention to and point out some of the work that needs to be done and is being done regarding gender and these diagnoses. Okay, so having been talking quite a bit and having had loads of slides, I am now coming to the end of what I want to formally say. And I'm going to go back to my picture about the diagnosis as, if you like, as an arrow on the tree, as a guide, as a way for moving forward. But it is not the diagnosis is not the person as such. It is not the person who walks the path, and nor is it the path. It can be a guide to self-understanding, a guide to self-acceptance, a direction for treatment, and hopefully something that is done in a skilled, empowering way. So those were some of the powers and the perils of diagnosis. I wanted to emphasize that the diagnostic systems are very much tools, and they literally say themselves that they are not to be used in a cookbook fashion. Individual experience clearly matters most, and if the diagnosis makes sense, it clicks into your self-image, it explains things, then that is what really counts. We systematically undervalue the role of diagnosis in self-understanding and the benefits of diagnosis in that way. Some of these topics are difficult to talk about. It can be difficult to talk about age. Some practitioners struggle to talk about the gendered aspect of this. For many years, certain professions, especially my one, the medical profession, especially men in it, like me, have struggled to talk about menopause and perimenopause in a way that is understanding and empowering for women. And I guess what I would say to anyone listening about that is that tone matters most in these conversations. And I think if we just put the issues on the table, most people will, in a respectful way, in a tone that really we're curious and want to try and understand. This will help people open up to talk about these complex interactions over time. And with regard to the last few years and the increased awareness of ADHD and autism, these developments are, in my view, very good, and menopause as well, indeed. Now, there are some downsides, and obviously, sometimes diagnosis is not used in the way that I outlined, the way it should be. However, I do believe that recent developments are mostly good, and we can shape them to be better, which is why I'm very happy to be speaking at this meeting today. I hope some of what I said made sense. As I say, I've sent on slides to someone and they can be circulated. And I chatted enormous length about the pluses and minuses of diagnosis in this free to download book, which you can just download if you want and read, and you can give out about it or enjoy it as you wish. But I do try to address all the thorny issues. Although I don't have a dedicated section on ADHD or autism, that will probably wait for the next edition. So thank you very much for listening to me today. I think I have finished in a timely fashion to facilitate any thoughts or questions. I will stop sharing my screen. I think there are some comments in the chat, which I would be happy to address over the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kelly, for this thoughtful and insightful presentation. Your reflections on substance, meaning, and emotional renaissance of diagnosis, particularly for neurodivergent adults diagnosed late in life, were both powerful and deeply thought-provoking. I especially appreciate your discussions around diagnostic manuals such as the DSM and the broader questions surrounding how diagnosis shapes identity, understanding, and mental health care. I believe your presentation has given us all an opportunity to reflect more carefully on identity, belonging, and mental health, and the human experience behind diagnosis. And now we will move now to the short question and answer session. And I see there's one question in
Mhm.
the chat, actually two. And this question is from Muriel. Professor Kelly, what is your opinion on the historic lived experience and critique from mad movements towards psychiatry and over pathologization connected to all the biases that the DSM-5 holds?
Yeah, I mean, I can't actually see that question, but a lot of the criticisms of psychiatry in the past have had, and indeed the present, do have quite significant basis, particularly the over pathologization. That is certainly something that has happened. And my opinion on the historical lived experience and critique from the mad movements, like obviously there's an enormous merit and truth in a great deal of it. There is, however, as well as the over pathologization, I think my concern is more with the pathologization part of that, because what we're looking at now with ADHD and autism is, if you like, not pathologization, I would say an under recognition that these conditions would have benefited from different kinds of support and treatment sooner. And Muriel, you go on there about the critics argue DSM lacks robust empirical and biological evidence. DSM, of course, like all, as I said, all diagnoses are based on symptoms, not biology. So there is no biological evidence, but there are clusters of symptoms. But there is very robust empirical evidence because DSM is based on field trials identifying commonly co-occurring clusters of symptoms. So what DSM says is these symptoms described tend generally to occur in clusters as we describe. It does not indicate a biological basis, because as I sense there is no clear identified biological basis for virtually any mental illness. And when a biological basis is discovered, it then ceases to be a mental illness and it becomes a medical or a neurological condition. But there is empirical evidence and extensive field studies that the symptom clusters described in DSM tend to co-occur. And so there is some merit in that, but they absolutely must be used, not in a rigid cookbook fashion, because each person's experience will be different, and people do not fit neatly into any categories, be they DSM or otherwise. So thank you, Muriel, for the questions and the comment there, which I really appreciate.
Thank you, Prof, for your for this wonderful the way you answered the question, and I think the words that you use, especially referring to the DSM-5 and how we need to use it, um, is extremely meaningful. We've got another question from Mel. And this question is, do you anticipate adequate funding being allocated to the psychiatric service ring-fenced rather than repeatedly borrowed from to allow for the catch-up in diagnosis of these conditions in the future?
Thanks. Thank you, Mel. So, look, historically, the answer has to be no. Looking at the historic allocation of service resources, there is little reason for optimism. We know that Sláinte Care plan here in Ireland says that 10% of the health budget should be devoted to mental health if we are still putting autism and ADHD under the mental health heading. So let's just say we are for this conversation. That it should be 10%. It is currently 6% of the health budget. But, despite the historical reasons for pessimism, I am innately an optimist. So I am going to say I think it will get better, but there's a lot of catch up to be done. And I think there is such a demand for robust assessment. I am not confident that resources will fully meet that. I'm sorry if that's a little downbeat for you. I do think we will do better, but I don't think we're going to do. I don't think. I think the word adequate might be slightly over optimistic, Mel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mel, for the question. Thank you, Prof. It's very interesting for me because coming from South Africa, it's very interesting to learn about these situations, especially what's happening in Europe. But when you look at the question that Tanya is asking, she's asking a question from Scotland, and her question is, there's an increasingly strong discourse in Scotland that people awaiting and assessment on the NHS don't actually need assessment and diagnosis. They just need to self-identify as neurodivergent and access appropriate support. As a neurodivergent clinician working in diagnosis, I know what I think about this, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Thank you, Tanya. The first thing that I mean, there's a certain line of discourse in Ireland along the same lines. And I don't like the notion that people who seek assessment don't actually need it. There's something, in my view, dismissive in the tone of people who say that. And I think people don't go searching for assessment and diagnosis out of nowhere. And I respect that very much. I also respect the idea of self-identifying as neurodivergent. But the simple fact is, self-identifying, as Joy is pointing out in the chat, often is not enough to access appropriate accommodations or to access support or to get what should reasonably be available. We're not talking about anything massive or special. We're just talking a human rights compliant level of accommodation. So I think people who seek assessment and or diagnosis should have prompt access to it if they feel they need it. I like when self-identifying is respected also, but that in terms of pragmatism, it is often necessary to get a diagnosis to access those supports. And Tanya, I'm most interested in your views as well as a neurodivergent clinician working in diagnosis. But it's really to come back to tone. I just don't like when I sometimes hear that there is this sort of stampede toward assessment and diagnosis, and the implicit implication that people do this lightly and without reason. I find that is never the case. People often have legitimate concerns and are often just as happy to have a good conversation and not be diagnosed as to have an assessment and diagnosing. And we do need to be very careful about the pathologizing lens, which I see coming up there in the chat too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you, Prof, once again for this meaningful contribution that you made. The following question, and this is an Irish name, so apologies if I pronounce it incorrectly, but I think it's Ifu McGettigan. The question is, brilliant presentation, Prof. Kelly. Thank you. I work in an older adult mental health team as a OT and often query presentations of service users as potentially neurodiverse. When I raise this with the MDT, there's a significant reluctance to address it out of fear of upsetting service users who have often navigated life with diagnoses such as anxiety, depression, OCD, etc., as well as perhaps a lack of understanding of the clinicians. I wonder, do you have any advice on encouraging colleagues to explore and address this formally with older service users? Interesting.
Yeah, no, really good. Thank you very much, Aoife. And that name was perfectly pronounced at the start. So listen, this is really, really difficult, encouraging colleagues to do things or facilitating colleagues to do things. But the point about it being older service users is really interesting to me because I find that older service users tend to be really pragmatic, down to earth, and very sensible. And what I like to do for any diagnosis is I often just print out the diagnostic criteria for something, sit down, have a face-to-face conversation with the person, and I say, look, uh, these are what the diagnostic criteria are. What do you think? Do you recognize yourself in any of this? How are you different? How are you the same? And very often, by just doing that in an extremely direct, pragmatic, respectful, and as non-hierarchical as we can manage fashion, um, once you do that, the person is usually really pragmatic and very relieved to have a direct, honest conversation about symptoms and problems that maybe all their lives they might have navigated life with a diagnosis of anxiety, depression, or OCD, but they might have always thought, that's not really me. Maybe, I'm different. There are other things, and I don't have this and I do have that. And I find, particularly for older adults, a lovely face-to-face conversation where one is critiquing the diagnostic criteria. They're not everything. Can be helpful, and sometimes other clinicians can find that good too. Because diagnoses, they're flexible, they can change, and we can always tell people, you might have had anxiety now in the past. I don't think that's the problem now. So just a very simple pragmatism, flexibility, and as DSM says, not using this in a cookbook fashion can be helpful. So I guess it's hard to know how to encourage colleagues, but I would encourage them for sure to be pragmatic, straightforward. And once you're partnering with the person, then really very, very little can go wrong in this conversation.
No, thank you so much, Professor Kelly, and thank you so much for your presentation and your willingness, your humbleness to be able to, and honesty to present on these important topics. As a neurodivergent individual myself, I could resonate with what you were saying. And I really think that you gave us food for thought. So thank you very much for this presentation and thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So our next, uh, well, firstly, thank you for Professor Kelly once again. It was an amazing. Now, our next speaker is already here, and I would like to introduce Dr. Marty Doherty and Una Sheehan. and their presentation is all about benefits of late diagnosis, conversation with a late diagnosed woman. So I just firstly want to introduce Dr. Mary Doherty, is a consultant, anesthetist, and clinical associate professor at the School of Medicine, University College Dublin. She is also an honorary associate professor at the University of Exeter and honorary clinical research fellow at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. Diagnosed as autistic over a decade ago, she is parent to two neurodivergent young people. Mary is founder of Autistic Doctors International, an organization dedicated to peer support, advocacy, research, and training. Her research interests focus on autism and healthcare, including both autistic people accessing healthcare services, as well as autistic healthcare providers. And I also would like to introduce Una as well. Una Sheehan is a late diagnosed autistic elder woman. Una holds a degrees in archaeology and art history and history research and is a retired tour guide and further education teacher. In recent years, she has been an active of As I Am in capital letters and is an advocate on the issue of financial abuse of autistic elders. Thank you very much, Mary and Una. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure it is to be here, and particularly to be having such a lovely chat with Una. Thanks for the introduction. I'm thinking, interestingly, Una and I have been friends for quite a number of years, and we know each other fairly well. We don't mask with each other, and yet there is this sense that, hang on, we're on this webinar. Can we actually be like, authentically autistic? And are we going to interact with each other? Are we going to mask as we interact with each other? That's really quite interesting, actually. And the answer to that is, I don't know. Una, what do you think? Do you have an answer? Let's see how it goes. You're muted, Una. Yeah, just click the unmute button.
The thing is to be free to talk and be the way one is. And I suppose if that's unmasked, for other people, then that's fine. They may note the difference. Maybe we wouldn't.
Well, that is true. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. So tell us a bit about yourself, because obviously I know, and my autistic mind is struggling to kind of, think about what I know and what everyone else knows about you, which is obviously very different. So go for it. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Um, well, when I was choosing a career as an archaeologist long ago, I now realize, of course, that it would have been very appropriate to be systemizing artifacts for most of one's natural life. It was only when I realized that I actually couldn't do the math that I, variegated into publishing and journalism and eventually teaching, and found my niche in tour guiding actually when I came home to Ireland, which was quite fun. So I was interested to see that that wonderful American artist actually recommended it as a career for autistic people. But certainly it was when I was diagnosed, through your good offices actually opening the door for me 7 years ago at a Trinity conference on the genetics of autism. Where is this autistic community that you talk about? And you said, oh yeah, it really exists. And I got in that way and was diagnosed by a South African psychologist, as it happened.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, go on.
That's right, Liesl.
Yeah, the South African connection. I forgot about that. Yeah.
That's right. And after 2 hours of being interviewed by her in DCU 7 years ago, she said, "Oh, this is so bad, it's good. You're definitely fit the criteria. There's no doubt about this." And I was so relieved actually to get the diagnosis because it made sense of a lot of my interests and some of the difficulties that I had in my life. I was just really relieved, and then I was actually quite thrilled. I thought this is really quite special, actually. And then a couple of months later, when a psychiatrist I knew said, "Well, it's incurable. That's why I didn't say anything about it." And I said, "Well, I mean." really wish I'd known. I wish I'd understood that earlier about myself. But I suppose it's a bit like wanting penicillin in the 19th century. Hard luck. It wasn't available. That was it. Now I'm really glad that at this stage in my mid-70s that this development in autistic studies has come along and more people are more genuinely familiar about it, and that I have become part of the autistic community through you and through as I am. And it has just made a whole lot of sense of my life. And for that, I'm really, really grateful.
Yeah, I
But
share
it's
that. Yeah, I share that sense. Absolutely. Everything just suddenly making
made
sense
sense.
in a way that we just didn't know before. Yeah.
Yeah,
What age were you
exactly.
when you were diagnosed? I was in my mid
70,
40s.
70,
70.
just after my just shortly after my 70th birthday. Yeah. But I mean, my parents actually knew, being doctors themselves, they knew. But my
They'd
dad told,
known, they'd known a long time, hadn't they?
they knew before I went to school, actually. And when my father called me into his study in 96, a couple of years before he passed away, he said, we knew there's this thing called Asperger's syndrome, and you were born.
Oh, has Una frozen, or is that just, or have I frozen?
Took our chances really, with it. And for that I'm really grateful, because I did get the same chances as my siblings in terms of education and college and all that kind of thing. It's just that sometimes the same chance can be a little bit irrelevant because it's not the particular chance that you need. So very often I felt that there's no point in talking about my difficulties because I'm clearly different from others. Um, and that created sort of awkwardness in a way, but I was always able to be on the same wavelength as Dad, actually, more than others. And so it was only, many years later than when a young relative was diagnosed that I got curious and went and got a book about it. And there I opened a page, Signs and Symptoms of Autism, and bang, I thought, God, and I got to the end of the second page, I looked up and I thought, well, that's familiar. I recognize that. It's like looking in a mirror, really. And I did the Baron Cohen test, and of course was way over the line. And then did the Channel 4 program, where Professor Simon Baron Cohen did a Channel 4 documentary, How Autistic Are You? And by the way, anybody who wants to join the program at the end and be assessed, on this questionnaire, do so. So I did that, and there was duly a note from that team saying, by the way, you fit the criteria, you really should follow it up. And that's why I found myself at that conference in
Tell us more about
TCD.
that conference. What was that conference?
It was genes and autism, the research, and I saw it online and I bullied my way onto it. And somebody came online, I think it was Louise, it could have been Louise O'Reilly, the professor.
Louise
And
Gallagher. Yeah.
Gallagher, yeah. I said, look, I'm in a hurry. I'm 70 years old. You've got lots of young people, lots of younger people, but how many elders do you? How many elders have you included? And she said, well, that's a good basis for including you. So, okay, you can come. And that's why I got into that room that day in Tala in February, what was it,
Yeah.
February 1990,
99 or 20,
99,
was it?
yeah,
99 or 20, I think. Yeah, yeah.
2019,
Because
yeah.
that's when we first met, wasn't it?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, because
I'm
you were on
thinking
the
of that
same
conference.
table as me,
Yeah.
and it was really good because they were sharing their research on autism with people who are researchers on the one hand and the autistic community on the other. And we were all on different tables, and you were on mine. And you spoke quite a lot about that. You used that phrase quite a lot, autistic community. And finally, when you were leaving, at the end of the day, dashing up, I actually grabbed your coat and said, tell me about the autistic community. Where is it? Is it an abstract notion? And I remember
Yeah.
you saying later, God, that's a very autistic question. Is it literally true or is it
Yeah.
symbolically true?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you were still wondering about yourself at that stage, weren't you? I think.
Well, I thought I would really like to officially know, because the important thing is one's sense of reality.
Yeah,
It was reality testing.
exactly. Yeah.
If I
Yeah.
really was, I actually wanted to know, and I wanted official
Mm.
recognition. I wanted to know that I was officially diagnosed or
Yeah.
not, because
Yeah.
the question was, if I wasn't, what really was this persistent problem in the shadows. So it was reality testing, and I passed that reality test when, standing up from that 2-hour test by Little Vinand, I knew that I was the real thing. So I thought, great, reality, tick the box. I'm
Do you remember?
okay autistic.
Yeah, because I remember that day, and I remember,
Mm.
we sat at that table, and you're blindingly, obviously autistic to me. Like I just knew within the first couple of minutes of our probably.
Annie and Kiro get, as we say, one recognizes another, as you
Yeah,
say in Irish.
exactly.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
we do, absolutely.
Mm.
But I do then also remember that sort of seeking that diagnostic process and how that
yeah.
went. And I'm just kind of, what was the pathway to getting that diagnostic assessment, and how was that so important? Why was that so important? Why was it kind of not enough to be to be validated by other autistic people?
Because first of all, well, reality testing, and secondly, legal protection.
Okay.
Because I had found myself the subject of a legal spat during probate, and other people took, I suppose the Americans would call it conservatorship, but here my inheritance went into trust, administered by other people who, the one person in the family who did not seem to be aware that there was a potential diagnosis there, being the only other non-medic. Everybody else is a medic except us two. And I knew facts about that whole thing that maybe other people didn't. And so I refused to kind of, go along with it really in a way, and said basically sort of see you in court. So it was kind of legal protection. You can't really, dismiss somebody who is properly diagnosed. You can dismiss them if you write them off and say that person's crazy. And, during my whole search, I had the benefit of a forensic psychiatrist, Brian McCaffrey, saying to me, "When you're not crazy, get out of here." And that was really funny. We had a good laugh about that, but it was really nice. It was one of my kind of phrases, but it was that kind of legal protection I felt I net. I said to the psychologist, I said, what I actually need is a report that will stand up in court, that will actually, you'll be able to wave it and people saying this was conducted in the proper manner with a standard test, and this person is, what used to be called Asperger syndrome, autistic level 1, masks very well, doesn't seem to have any special needs, is carrying on, has a couple of degrees and professional qualifications, the whole 9 yards. It was that sort of certitude, insofar as it's possible with these diagnoses, because
I hear you. That, I
that
mean,
was
I remember
important,
that sense of knowing for sure,
Yeah.
not being certain, not wondering. Yeah, absolutely. Did it also sort of, in terms of mental health throughout your life, did it sort of change how you view that?
Yes, it did, because there's no doubt I was what was viewed as a sulky teenager. I was just a very depressed little teenager stuck in boarding school, which I, cordially loathed, not because there's anything wrong with it. It was a lovely school, but I was just a total misfit in that highly social atmosphere that a boarding school requires. And I kind of carried on until it was unsustainable at postgraduate work, when I couldn't complete, academic work that I was doing. And I kind of came home and I got a bit of therapy with Ivor Brown and Professor Ivor Brown and so on. And that was actually very interesting. But I do wish he'd put me aside and said, "Una, you're as typical an Asperger as I've ever seen. This is a profile, if this helps you to understand, But then, of course, there was so much stigma, really, until relatively recently, about autism and
Yeah, and
shame.
people didn't even recognize it,
Exactly.
in psychiatry, for
Yeah.
sure. And it's still, to a large degree, often, it's often missed.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. So, there have been bouts of sort of, depression and anxiety kind of wavering around, but they're comorbidities to the main event, which is autism, which is just a sort of a different psychological profile to other people. Now that I know, it's like, it's one of those Popeye thing, I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I am who I am, sort of thing. And,
Absolutely.
when I
Yeah.
get, either depressed or kind of very anxious, I know that sort of, goes along with it. And so it has given me a security, an epistemological security, if you like, that I did not have when I was much younger and struggling really for help. And so I have had rounds of therapy and care and stuff, which has really been very helpful to me, to realize it's all part of a bigger picture. Everybody suffers in their own way. And, it's neither less nor more than anybody else, but to know that there's a bigger picture to which this is relevant and to which this is recognizable. I mean, you said you understood I was, autistic the minute you met me, more or less, I didn't know that I was so kind of obviously so. And it kind of heartens me to know there's recognition that that person's Spanish, that person's Italian, that person's Irish, that person's autistic, that person's really
Exactly.
not,
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
recognition factor is really important,
Absolutely, isn't it? And to see it as being different, like we're not disordered, defective, it's
Yeah,
just, as you say, a different way of being. And it's like,
yeah,
we don't kind of, we accept people from, various different places with various different accents. And if English isn't somebody's first language, then we don't expect them to have perfect grammar or syntax.
that's
You
that's
know,
the very
like we don't expect Emil to be able to pronounce, Irish names.
exactly.
You just wouldn't even bat an eyelid at
Mm,
people from different places, having different accents or making,
yeah,
mistakes in English. Why is that not the same for us as neurodivergent people? Why are we
exactly.
expected to like speak neurotypical? It's
Yeah.
not, it's not our native language.
Yeah, yeah.
No.
And I think actually this has helped, in my personal life. I've had friends from all over the world, from England to Bangladesh to Italy to America, whatever. I remember an American once saying to me as a great compliment, God, you're the most American person I've ever met. What are you doing in Ireland? And I said, you're like us, actually, it's the other way around.
Mm.
So that kind of lack of judgment, really of not excluding people simply for who they are, which is in itself inherently interesting because they're a particular individual. I think appreciation of individuality is something we do, actually.
Yeah, totally. And even
Mm,
about, even in terms of sort of accepting ourselves. Like
yes,
I've found it has
yeah,
been like knowing that I'm autistic has been just completely transformative, in terms
absolutely,
of my own
absolutely.
identity, my mental health, my just the way I view myself. Have
Yes,
you found similar?
absolutely, absolutely. And it's that transformative thing. I'm actually all right. I've been exploring differences and difficulties, and I do understand that, but actually inherently I'm okay. And it kind of resonates with something, I felt with my dad, that as far as he was concerned, I was lovely and interesting and okay. And it was only when kind of high socialization requirements were made of me to enact or to perform a particular role in a particular way, that's what made me uncomfortable. And for example, that musician that was talking this evening, I was really good at music. I won the Sligo Festival when I was 9. I was on the radio and this kind of stuff. And my mother brought me a grand piano because she thought, now here's the beginning of a musical career. And I just shrank totally. I just wouldn't play it. I wouldn't touch it, because the idea of having to perform that, for all of my life, it just kind of really made me kind of shrink inside, even though music was a tremendous resource, all during school. I didn't want to be performing it as part of my identity, really in a way. But in myself, I thought, well, I know what I can do, and I know what I like. And, I don't have to do maths or anything else, to prove that I'm all right,
And
but
would you
it's
have
been
had
it's been a great consolation.
Yeah, actually, do you know what's really interesting what you said there about your dad giving you this sense that you were all right?
Yeah, yeah,
That
yeah.
is such a powerful gift.
Yes,
I
yes.
would have also had somebody in my life, it was an aunt, who
Mm,
gave me that sense very, very clearly.
yes,
She
yes, yeah,
saw, she lived in the States actually, and she would come back and visit us. And she saw me for who I was. I think,
yeah.
looking back, she may not have known what she was looking at, but she certainly saw that I
Mm,
was different. And she very clearly gave me that sense, you're okay,
yes,
just as you
yeah,
are. You be
yeah,
you. You do
yeah.
you, you be you. And even though that was not the message I was getting from any other direction in the world, um,
Mm,
just that one was enough. I think
yes,
as I look back, I think she saved me,
yes,
just that
yes.
sense. And again, it's what kind of drives so much of the work that I do at the moment is around, just empowering families to
Yes.
allow kids to grow up confidently autistic, you
Yes.
know. And then
Yes.
for those of us who are late diagnosed to get to that sort of, you know, pathway, you know, to take that path, becoming
Mm.
confidently autistic, learning who
Yes.
we are, you know.
Mm.
Um, so important to have that validation.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's tough when it's not when that's not coming from other directions. Like I think back school was just hideous. How about you? How was it for you?
Well, it was really funny in school, actually. It became kind of comical in the end. There used to be a thing called a merit reward at the end of the term, like there was a film, and you get kind of black marks during the term time if you did things that were inappropriate or weren't approved of.
Mhm.
I only made it once and they cheered when I came in. You know, it was so rare for Una, who doesn't know what she's doing wrong and generally bumbling around, but she made it once, you know, it was a special effort because I hadn't a clue about all these unwritten social,
Yeah.
rules. I would just, charge through them or amble through them and not notice, which
Mm,
I thought was a benefit of being sort of a free thinking person,
mm.
things that I thought were nonsense I said nothing about. Um, and other
Yes,
people
that
really,
hidden
and gave other
critic.
people the benefit of the doubt, and
Mm,
people didn't give me the benefit of the doubt or the freedom that I was expressing. And it was
yeah.
just not acceptable in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I remember that sense of what on earth is going on here. You know,
Exactly.
like other people had the rule book, you know, they
Yes,
had the instruction manual, you know.
exactly.
I just didn't have that. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, it's really hard, you know, and like, you know, it's easy enough to if you know what's going on, if you understand that sort of dynamic, it's easy enough to explain, like
Hmm.
overtly, you know, really explicitly what the
Yeah.
expectations are, what the rules are, what's, you know, what the expectation is. But if that isn't given, it can be really, really hard, you know.
But
Um,
the thing is, the expectations are present, even though they're not articulated, and they're supposed to be really high and really good and really the best and all the rest of it. And you say, well, actually, I can't manage that somehow, but I'm not doing
yeah,
anything wrong.
yeah. No, it's just different,
Tricky,
just different. Yeah. And then thinking about sort of getting to later in life and looking back at sort of getting to 70 and not knowing
Mm,
this about yourself, you
mm.
know. How's that feel?
Well, I feel as if I feel kind of strange that other people knew what
Mm,
my oddness was about and that I didn't.
mm,
You know, I felt that was really very odd.
mm,
It was a sort of that kind of bump when you're driving a car and you stop and you get this kind of whiplash moment
mm,
and you
mm.
think, ouch, gosh, yeah, everybody else is really the same and I'm really different from them.
Yeah,
How my attitude is, like how weird,
yeah. I
you
remember
know?
asking a colleague soon enough after I got my
Mm,
diagnosis, and I asked him, "Did you know?" And he
yeah,
went, "Knew there was something. Didn't know what it was, but I knew there was something." You know,
I
and
know.
yeah, that sense of like, gosh, everybody knew, and
Well, that's the thing,
yeah,
you see, people actually do sense it.
mm,
And,
for
the
sure. Yeah.
response from, friends and family was actually quite interesting. And the best response came from an old flame of mine in Rome who I sent an email about. He was wise enough not to ask me to marry him. And I sent him this email, and he actually picked up the phone and rang. And he
Mm,
said, I always knew you were an original, he said. And so I didn't disturb you. I let you be your original self, sort of thing. And I thought that was wonderful, really, because I
mm,
thought there was a recognition, she's other, she's different, she's never going to conform. But let her be, kind of thing. And
yeah.
I really appreciated that. I thought that was great. Yeah, I really did.
Yeah, no, that sense of acceptance is
Mm,
just it's transformative, you know.
mm, mm.
Um, yeah, it really is. And that's
But
why
of
it's
course,
important to
the
know.
peculiarity about my situation is that I came from a medical family that has two psychiatrists and a doctor, in them. And when I challenged them on this, one of them said, well, it's kind of incurable. There's nothing you can do about it, really. And the other one had really a bit more
Which is
empathy
just
about
such,
it.
yeah, that's just such an unhelpful approach.
Well,
You know, isn't it? It's like it's just,
it was realistic. And in that, I sort of, it's the realistic bit
but it's the
that,
medical model framing,
sure,
the idea that this is some sort of, you know, illness or disorder or something that you would even want to think in terms of, you know, a cure. Um,
mm,
Whereas it's not at all. I mean, people used to think that about homosexuality.
Yeah.
Like it's only 50 years ago since homosexuality was in that very same diagnostic manual,
Mm.
that we heard about a few, in the last speaker,
Yeah.
Prof Kelly, and it was like being queer, being gay
Yeah.
was,
Mm.
designated a mental illness. It was in that
That's
same
right.
manual,
That's right.
and people tried to cure it.
That's right. Yeah.
When we look at how society has changed over the last couple of decades, like it's just wild
Hugely.
to think that
Absolutely.
now,
Absolutely.
um,
Enormously. And especially here in Ireland in the last
yeah,
30 years, the last 50 years, it's
and
unrecognizable,
you know,
you know.
yeah, I mean, there is still stigma. There is still,
Mm.
it's not, we haven't, come to where we need to be, but we're well along that pathway, and we absolutely need to take that path with being autistic, neurodivergent,
Yes.
as well, because
While recognizing the realism of the fact that that is how neurotypical society sees it, as
absolutely, yeah,
that
yeah,
that's
yeah,
the truth
yeah, absolutely,
according to them,
yeah, exactly, according
and
to them, and
you have
yeah,
to
yeah,
engage with that,
mm,
that's how they
yeah.
see it, and okay,
Exactly. If the
you know,
numbers were flipped the other way around and we were in the in the
yeah,
majority rather
yeah,
than in the minority,
yeah,
and society was set up for our needs, then it would be non-autistic people, neurotypical people who
of
would be
course,
the ones who would be seen to be having difficulties.
inherently disordered sort of
Yeah,
thing,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, 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 exactly. We'd be talking about maybe curing neurotypicality.
I think there was a film about that in the Twilight Zone many, many years ago, where
Right,
you see
right.
that
Yeah,
playing with that kind of meme,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
who's
yeah.
beautiful, who's not beautiful. And then you see in
Mm,
the last frame that the person who's got a problem is really actually very ugly, not beautiful at all. But that's the norm in their
yeah,
society.
yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Tell us how it helped knowing that you were autistic in terms of healthcare, because I know you've had some interesting experiences there.
Yes, it was quite fun actually when quite fun when I broke my leg. Yeah, great. I when I did fall and broke my leg about 5 years ago, I actually had my as I am ID card with me, and I had my lanyard, invisible disabilities, and I actually had them in my bag. So when I arrived in Vincent's Hospital here, I actually produced them out of my bag and I kind of put them on. And to my great surprise and delight, they said, "Oh yeah, great. We recognize you. Fine. We'll speed you along here. And this is sort of a quiet part of A&E that we'll diagnose you and all the rest of it." And they really treated me extremely well. And I, in my turn, wore my lanyard and my ID card every day and ran the ongoing autism awareness seminar for, elder injured people and how to treat them in hospital. It was every day there were people coming in and, you couldn't possibly be autistic. Yes, I am. And that was actually a very good kind of interplay. But they gave me what I needed. They put me in a quiet corner beside a window. Then they took me away into a corner with a curtain where I wasn't disturbed. Then I was lucky enough to get a room on my own, when I was in nursing. And even though I was a long time in hospital, weeks and weeks, it was like 8 weeks or 10 weeks or something. They really gave me absolutely everything I needed as an autistic person. They made accommodations for that. The nurse manager was terrific. Somebody came in with an offer of a place, and we've only got 4 people in the ward. And I said, "You don't understand. I don't want anybody else near me when I'm sick." And they were kind of astonished, "But our facilities are wonderful." I said, "I don't judge you. It's just that I don't need that and I don't want that." So they really accommodated me really well, and I made a super convalescence, and I haven't had a bother with it since, and it was really quite a bad compound fracture, They said, "How
Yeah,
did you do that?"
sure.
So I've
And
got
it
a
can,
chunk of steel under my knee, my peg leg. But
but
it was very interesting.
it can be really hard to explain to people, that like we just want to be left alone. We don't want to be, we don't want chit chat.
Absolutely.
We don't want, like other
Yeah,
people, just talking to us and chatting to us, and
that's right.
um it can
And
be
and
really,
yet one isn't doing a great garbo, "I want to be alone" kind of thing. It's just that I actually need to be alone, peace and quiet, and not to be disturbed. And I'll be grand then, and I'll come out and socialize then. But
oh,
until I've
absolutely.
had that,
Mm.
I can't,
Yeah,
deal with lots of people.
I describe that as restorative solitude.
Yeah,
And I
exactly. Exactly.
absolutely need it. I
Absolutely.
absolutely like it's not optional. It's not even
Mm,
something that I that I like. It's something that I absolutely
Actually
need.
need. Yeah. Yeah.
I cannot function without being alone
Yeah.
for significant enough chunks
Yeah.
of time. Really enjoy it, but I
Mm.
genuinely need it. Yeah.
But it was very difficult to get to a diagnosis. The first GP I mentioned it to, she just brushed me away. She said, you don't need it at your age, you don't come across as autistic, blah, blah, blah. And I just said, actually, I really do. And my current GP is great. She deals with the geriatrics in our practice, in a group practice, and she has somebody in the family who's autistic. And so she actually knows how to deal with me. And we get on super. But it literally took me years from December 2016 to February 2019 to get to a diagnosis. And even then I was really lucky, and it was through you and Joan that opened the door for me through
There is
that.
this.
I was incredibly lucky. I really was,
Yeah.
because it's very
Yeah, no,
rare.
it is rare. That's
It
the
was
thing.
hard. It was
Yeah, and
hard to
there is.
get to it.
Yeah, and there is this sense that, for older autistic people or older people
Mm,
who might be autistic, sure, what's the point?
exactly.
There's no point at this stage. Why would you
Yeah,
want that?
that's right.
Absolutely not. And like that's
Mm,
some of the work that I'm doing is with a group who are specifically looking at aging issues, in our
yeah.
and we even had a think tank at the United Nations, as you know,
Oh, yes.
last
I'm
year,
so proud of you,
where
actually. The
we were
photograph came
talking
back. Yeah.
where we were talking about,
Mm,
issues relating to older autistic people, and
mhm.
even the irony of that, like a lot of the research up to a couple of years ago, when we
Mm.
talked about late diagnosis, they were talking about teenagers.
I laughed. I
Yeah,
said,
yeah,
talk
yeah,
about a
yeah.
real late
Yeah.
diagnosis
So
at 70.
yeah, exactly. So
Mm,
now, there is this growing awareness in sort of geriatrics
yeah,
and in psychiatry of old age. There's
absolutely.
this sort
Yeah,
of like, oh my God, we've missed all these people,
absolutely. Who have masked.
masked and who've suffered. Not
Yeah,
suffered, we don't suffer because we're autistic. We suffer because we don't know we're autistic. And we
yes.
suffer because we don't understand how to set up a life that suits us, that works with our nervous systems, that works with our sensory needs.
Mm, yeah.
Actually, that's an interesting one that we didn't touch on. Talk to me about sensory stuff. What did you discover about sort of your sensory needs? Um,
Well, I'm certainly very sensitive to sound.
mm,
And at one stage, I was treated with lithium, and too big a dose of lithium, and that damaged my hearing. Which was really a pity. I really loved music, and I have tinnitus now because of that. But then there was the thing about kind of radar. I felt it's kind of like a living radar walking down the street. I would just pick up so much kind of on that. And at one stage, that kind of, clicked out and really didn't come back. Maybe because I was just getting too overwhelmed by stuff. But I find now at this stage, in my hearing and my sight and various things are kind of going sort of more shadowy offline. I'm beginning to miss the senses, and the acute feedback, they give you. But then
that's
I suppose they say
interesting.
that's aging, but.
No, wait, let me stop you. That's interesting because I'm starting
Mm.
to lose my hearing at this stage and I'm enjoying it. I'm really liking the fact that the volume of the world has turned down.
Yeah, but your
Um,
friends won't,
but actually,
with my
yeah,
friends
no,
shouting at me,
yeah, yeah,
saying,
yeah,
get
yeah,
hearing aids. I have
yeah.
hearing aids on at the moment, so,
Yeah, that is
they're
fair. I,
helping.
I need hearing aids, but from a
Mm.
sensory point of view, I can't bear anything kind of touching my ears. So
Yes,
I have
yeah.
avoided it. But what I use is the AirPods.
Oh,
The
yes,
new the
yeah.
new AirPods are
Oh,
actually
yes, they're as good as
they're
better
they're
than hearing aids,
they're
apparently. Yeah,
certified as a
yeah,
medical, as a hearing aid, and they work brilliantly. They're
yes.
fabulous. I love them. But
Mm,
at the same time, just being able to turn off the world is just brilliant.
yes.
So I really enjoy that. But what I'm noticing as my eyes are deteriorating,
Yes,
my light sensitivity is getting worse.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I'm finding
yeah,
that really difficult.
yes, yeah.
That is hard. Yeah.
Mm, mm.
But like, even in terms of people thinking about say residential care for autistic people, you know,
God.
oh,
That's a sort of a nightmare for me because I really loathed boarding school, not because there was anything wrong about it, but it's just that it was too much 24/7, too much
yeah,
having people all the time. I
yeah,
found that really difficult. So that's a recurring nightmare. I
same,
just want to
same.
fall away from that. Actually, when I broke my leg, I felt myself going backwards and I thought, oh God, if I land on my back, my hip will go, and that'll be me. in a residential care. So I flipped myself forward, and
Right.
landed on my arm and, so forth, and landed a bit awkwardly. But at least it kept me out of that kind of,
Yeah,
lying
we
on my
need
back for a
we
summer.
definitely need some alternatives, in terms
Mm,
of, autism. I don't use the term autism friendly very much
mm,
because, it doesn't, yeah. I think what we need is autism competent care. I think,
yes.
like we don't need a lot of the work that I do is around, autism awareness and education and training in the medical world,
Yeah.
and, we need to go way beyond autism friendly healthcare.
Yeah.
We need
Yeah.
autism competent healthcare. We need every
Yes.
doctor to be familiar with what it
Yeah.
means to be autistic and what our needs are.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're a long way from that yet, I think,
I'm
even though
afraid
things are
so,
improving.
because when I got out of Vincent's, within 24 hours, when I was in a physical therapy
Mm,
unit, I found them, quite incompetent in terms of autism awareness. They're bashing in and out without knocking on doors and this kind of thing. I mean, that's just not, personal awareness of the kind of politeness norms of the society. It was just actually dysfunctional. And
mm.
I very nearly fell again. And, within 24 hours, I said, bring me back to Vincent's, please.
Yeah,
They know
yeah,
how
no,
to deal with
no,
us there,
yeah, yeah, no, I
you
remember that,
know. And it
and
was petty things like that that really drove me bananas. And that was supposed to be doing physical therapy, rehabilitation. I said, honestly, I'm going backwards here. I've
the
got to get
little
out.
bit of awareness, though, the little
Yeah,
bit of training made
yeah,
such a massive difference, didn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Just once people realized that it bothers us as autistic people in different ways to
Mm, mm,
non-autistic people. Like a
yeah,
non-autistic person mightn't like somebody barging into their room unexpectedly.
mm.
But for us, that's a completely different level of just dysregulation. Um, yeah,
I fell
and it just,
again.
Yeah.
I nearly fell again, and I just thought that would have undone all the
Mm.
good work by the surgical team in Vincent's.
Yeah, because it's the level of anxiety and the level of sort of anticipation
Yeah,
for unexpected things.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It's
that's
sort of a
really
big startle
mm,
factor there, I
mm,
guess, in
mm.
autistic people.
Yeah, and just that constant sense of being on edge and waiting
Yeah,
for the unexpected. Whereas when you know what's going to happen,
yeah,
the difference is just phenomenal, isn't it?
yeah. Sure, you can relax. You're not
Yeah.
on the qui vive all the time.
Mm, mm,
Mhm.
mm. Yeah, 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 exactly. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And it's like, where do we go in terms of trying to raise awareness, for the needs of older autistic people? Because gosh, there's so many.
Where do you start?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm,
I
yeah.
think the double effect of being autistic and elders, the presumed incompetence
Mm,
that comes in your direction when you're older.
mhm,
Maybe as an autistic person, one is kind of more aware of this, but they expect you to
mhm.
be sort of incompetent. And I suddenly realize how much ageism, can be a factor there and how it compounds.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I find interesting is the intersection of autism and ADHD. Which we're
Yes,
only recently, in the last couple of years,
yes.
starting to realize. I mean, even like up until the last edition of the
Hmm.
DSM, which was
Hmm.
2013,
Hmm.
just a sec, Pat, 2013, sorry, excuse me, I have a knock at the door.
2022 has been the recent one,
Yes,
number
that
five.
was
Yeah.
the text revision, but the last sort of big change to the criteria
Oh, yeah.
was when that was the first time that you could actually diagnose autism and ADHD simultaneously in the same person. Up until 2013, they were mutually exclusive.
Exclusive, yeah, they were
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
either or.
mm,
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, that's actually important in a way, because even though I was diagnosed autistic and only for autism, I think I'm probably more DHD,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because certainly, certain people thought I was bipolar when I was younger because I'd have exhaustion and then I'd revive and think, okay, let's do lots of stuff.
Mhm.
That's more, and the patterns relating to that are more DHD.
Yeah,
ADHD sort
absolutely.
of
I mean,
stuff.
I have a dual diagnosis as well,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
like,
yeah.
I got my autism diagnosis first, and it was like 2 years later that I got the ADHD diagnosis. And like,
That's right.
wow,
Yeah.
what a difference,
Yeah, because reading about that stuff, I found I resonated, quite a lot with that. And
Mm.
when I saw that was possible, I thought, now that makes sense.
But what's interesting? I think about people who are working in memory clinics.
Mm.
And, particularly maybe autistic women, postmenopausal autistic women, who experience, sort of brain fog, memory issues. Is it
Yeah.
menopause related? Is it ADHD related? Or is it actually, something like an early dementia? I think there's probably a lot of people who are on that,
Yes. Mm.
dementia pathway,
Mm.
who actually may be autistic, may have co-occurring ADHD. We don't know what
Mhm.
ADHD looks like in older adults. We just
Mhm.
don't have the research.
It certainly opens up, development pathways in geriatric psychiatry there that really need
Absolutely.
exploring, as Professor Kelly
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah,
saying earlier.
yeah, 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 absolutely, yeah. And then of course there's the doctors who are autistic themselves, because there's loads. You know.
Well, it certainly selects for it, acute diagnosis, perception, sensory awareness of things,
Yeah, 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 yeah,
that goes along with it. I mean,
yeah,
I
yeah,
remember seeing somebody at a wedding a couple of years ago, and I said, "Did he get COVID?" He came from America. I said, "Did he get COVID? He looks really unwell." And
yeah.
I told my sister, I said, "Honestly, he's unwell." But because the person in question was a doctor, I thought, well, goes to Newcastle, why bother to tell him? But I kept coming back to it, and sure enough, later he was diagnosed with cancer, actually. So those kind of, perceptual skills of difference, and, they're really select for good
Oh, absolutely.
diagnosis of other people,
Pattern
being able to
spotting.
see it at glance.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
like we're really
Absolutely.
good at recognizing patterns,
Patterns,
you
yeah.
know?
Dad used to always talk about patterns of
Mm.
behavior, patterns of illness.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mm,
exactly, yeah.
mm.
But the issue that I see a lot is people who know that they're autistic or suspect that they're autistic. Societal stigma is such that a lot of people just don't want to acknowledge it, you know?
Yes, and I think that's very unfortunate. I do know a younger person who's the son of a friend of mine, and the family are all dancing around him. And I told him years ago, I said, "Look, that's my report.
Mm.
If there's anything in it that you resonate with, and it really, just let me know and get diagnosed, or just do the test. It's just reality testing." And he really wouldn't. And I really, because he's abroad in another country, there's a lot of stigma there. He's really frightened about closing down possibilities for his life. I mean, he was just, what do you say when somebody offers a graduation present of an autism test, which I did, that was my gift to him, arrange that, but no, he wasn't having it. And I think it's really such a pity because he's had difficulties. And I do wish he
Yeah,
would just bite the bullet and just do the test. And if he's not, then it's something else. But I do think he is. I really do.
well,
And
we do.
or DHD as well,
I mean, we do recognize each other,
Oh yeah.
I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
I don't think I've been wrong yet.
Odar. Odar.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Oh, there for
Mm,
sure.
mm.
Yeah. Kind of looking back, Una, though, over your life, and thinking again to the next generation, what would you offer them? What do they need? What do you see the younger generation needing?
Well, not only duty of care, but duty of candor. Tell them, let them know. I
Yeah.
mean, when I was young, 75 years ago, that really wasn't an option because they would have been institutionalized and that would have been it.
Yeah.
But now, when there's so much knowledge and awareness, you have a duty of candor to them and say, "Look, this is the truth about this,
Yeah.
about this condition. You can play it up, you can play it down. There's lots you can do with it." Personally, I think Silicon Valley has helped a lot. It's up to the rafters as it is, and that lovely book Neurotribes.
Oh, Steve
That has really
Silberman. Yeah.
Steve
Yeah.
Silverman's book.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember when I got him to autograph my book, he said, "God, Ian Power, you've really read this," and I said, "Yeah, and several times over. It's just so good."
For sure. Yeah. And for
But no.
anyone on the call who hasn't read it, please do. It's a brilliant book.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a proud demonstration on my shelf, my whole, my
Yeah.
autograph copy. But
Yeah.
now there's so much more known actually about this, and so much help and support for autistic kids and teens and young people. Just remember there are older people like me who wish you well and wish you the best and hope that it's not as hard for you as it was for us. I had a nickname for my mask when I was 11 years old. Old stony faced, these sort of Indian chiefs in the store, completely
Okay.
poker faced, That was my nickname at 11 years
And you were
old.
aware
Oh,
back
yeah.
then.
Yeah. Because I had a nickname for that mask, and just a poker face in most situations. That was my upbringing, that was normal for the time. But I just hope that lots of younger kids are more confidently autistic and believe that they have something to offer, something special to offer. That kind of feedback, consciousness wouldn't be possible without the feedback of the critical voice that's doing something quite different, showing that there are always other possibilities for everything. That's how we get brain stereo.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because
And the
there are
world
two
needs that.
speakers, one that is
Yeah.
normal, which is grand, and one that is different. It's that feedback. So I hope kids grow up knowing that they're doing that for society and for themselves, and they're happy and confident in doing that, and they're let do that. They're let, particularly girls,
Yes,
girls.
exactly. Yeah, particularly girls for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, because the girls are being missed
yeah,
so much, and I think particularly older women,
yes,
for
yeah,
sure. Thinking about like so many kids are getting diagnosed now, and the parents are recognizing, that they're autistic as well.
yes,
What
yes,
about granny and granddad? You know?
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. I realized that my grandmother's sister was seen as deaf and dumb. She was, a very skilled dressmaker, but I do wonder if she was a
Mhm.
non-speaking autistic.
Yeah, I had
Very.
an aunt the same. I when
Mm,
yeah, I look back, undoubtedly autistic. My mum,
mm,
undoubtedly
mm,
autistic. My
mm.
kids' granny. I'm not sure about other grandparents, but quite likely.
Yeah,
But that's the
yeah,
thing, and it's just about having these conversations, isn't it? And
yes,
just raising the possibility so that people can think about the
yeah,
older people in their lives. Older people
that's right.
themselves can think.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
And in public, so that it's shared, that it's not so different watching autistic people talk to one another. Maybe it's
exactly.
slightly different, but it's in public and it's unmasked, it's free conversation.
Thinking
Um,
about this, I did mask a bit through this. Anyway, that's
well, of
we
course,
need to
you have a role to play.
finish. We're at time. We are
Good.
at time.
Okay.
But I really
Always a
enjoyed
pleasure to
it.
talk to you, Mary.
All right, we'll
And
talk soon.
thank you again for
Yeah,
opening the door.
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Una, for this wonderful presentation. For our viewers, I wanted to ask and to listen to this authentic conversation between two autistic individuals. And it's quite interesting to know, to listen to the experiences as someone coming from South Africa. Although we're in different continents, in different worlds, we've got similar experiences as well, and that is what reasonable accommodation is all about, in order to support each other. And that's why we refer to autism as a different ability instead of a disability. So thank you very much, Una and Mary, for this wonderful conversation, this authentic conversation. They always say
Very
that
welcome.
conversations between autistic individuals, you are walking on hollow ground. So thank you very much. So thank you very much for this.
You're welcome.
So looking on our schedule now, we will now take a short 10-minute break before continuing with session 5. So I
Okay.
encourage everyone to take a moment to stretch, refresh, and return for what promises to be another meaningful discussion focused on lived realities, daily challenges, and strengths of neurodivergent individuals. So we will resume in about 8 minutes, European, in 8 minutes. So thank you very much, and we see you soon.